I also want to ask folks, though, to please put themselves on mute when they're not talking. We have a chat box here where you can put questions into the chat box, and we will pass those along to Keith. So, Lisa, anything you'd like to add? You're good. Okay, Keith, it's all yours.
Great. Well, Kathleen and Lisa, thank you so much for having me and having almost all of the county foresters join you for these sessions. I think it's a really cool way to kind of help us continue to do our work engaging private landowners and our partners in our work to help keep forests healthy. I had to do a little bit of juggling, and so I'll apologize if there's some interruptions. I have my third parent is taking care of my child in the background, and so there may be some interruptions. Right now is also the time of day that my wife is teaching dance class in the house, so it's extremely loud, and my office is right next to her studio. So I actually am in my sister-in-law's house next door presenting. So we've done a bit of juggling, and things may, there may be some juggling during the next hour. So bear with me. But as Kathleen said, I came into this position from being a county forester. Chittenden County Forester, started in 2011 and came into this position around 2015. Prior to being a county forester, I was a consulting forester out of Waterbury, and so I've been doing private lands work, private lands forestry work in Vermont since 2003, and I just love it. And right now, I don't do forestry as much. I do a lot more coordinating of people and working with programs and partners and things like that, and doing my best to help the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation both equip landowners to do good management in their forests and support an environment, a social, cultural, legal, and economic environment that is conducive to landowners owning their land, keeping it intact, and managing it well. So to do that, this series has been about county foresters, and a huge part of my work is helping to support them. Some background of county foresters: the County Forester program started in the 40s, and at the time there were 12 county foresters. Consulting foresters weren't a major thing, and the major role of the county forester was to work with farmers, which was the primary ownership pattern at the time, to support them and basically do what consulting foresters do today: help them take care of their woods, do something other than liquidate their forest, and manage it in a way that ensured continued availability of product and maintaining other environmental values. During the following years, the 12 county foresters carried right up until, I think it was 2009, when we added a 13th. But since the 40s, so our numbers haven't changed dramatically. But you can imagine a lot of the other things that require county forester work. We have way more forest land than we did in the 40s. We have way more awareness of why we need forest land and how it contributes to our health, the health of the environment, our economics, tourism, wildlife habitat, and things like that. And at the same time, the current use program came into play and has really changed the role of the county forester in providing private lands assistance. So while we've had the same number of county foresters for a long time, the work of the county foresters has changed dramatically. over time. Right now, some of the major work that the county foresters are doing is through the use value appraisal program, and I think that in a lot of the presentations that's come up. There are some huge benefits from the program, and as folks know, got to have a forest management plan, a minimum of 25 acres, and need to actively manage your forest land for saw timber unless it's enrolled in the an ecologically significant treatment area or some other categories. So there are some kind of structural elements to that program which are really valuable both to landowners and to the state. But beyond the program itself, it is an avenue to connect landowners to consulting foresters, to loggers, and to county foresters to begin conversations that help better connect landowners to their own land, to appreciate the values that they support, and to understand how to manage it in ways to both better connect to those values and enhance the benefits that they provide, both to the landowner themselves and to the state more broadly. So that's kind of the big picture stuff that I work to support, partnering with folks like Coverts, Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Forest Products Association, and many other partners. We try to figure out where each of us fits in this effort, and support each other in it, and try to minimize conflicts and maximize the opportunities that we can pursue. And just 1 second, I'm glad I gave you a warning about this.
We'll let Keith chat away, and I will tell us a little bit about one of my favorite things that Keith has taught me when he goes out in the woods is about water. And I love that he talks about you want to slow it down, you want to spread it over the landscape, and you want to sink it. And I don't know why, but that's always, I've heard it before, but it's always stuck with me when Keith said it. So I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about water and AMPs and things like that potentially, but I figure I share that while he has his commercial break.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Problem solved. So in addition to the county foresters, and in addition to UVA, there's a whole bunch of other work that we do. I also work with Dave Wilcox, who's the watershed forester for the state, and he delivers, he runs the AMP program and the heavy cut program. Some of the, we call them the regulatory elements of the forestry division, but in reality, the major thrust of that work is technical assistance and outreach, working with LEAP and other programs to make sure people are aware of things like Lisa just shared, why it's important to take care of water quality, how it enables us to continue to actively manage our forests, and what are the implications if we don't do it effectively. And so Dave and his team helps to really do a bunch of that work. Beyond it, we're also working with DEC and a lot of the Lake Champlain water quality stuff. And so there are a whole bunch of strategies that we're working on to help deliver the environmental quality incentives program and regional conservation partnership programs through NRCS. And work with other funding from the state to support clean water, as significant of a role that forests play in providing clean water, which is at its core the best possible land use to maintain clean water. There are ways that we can do it better, particularly in managed forests, and that's making sure that when we manage our forests, that we take care of the roads and the water bars and the landings, and really minimize the erosion that's occurring on forest roads, and making sure that it gets filtered by the natural forest as opposed to running straight down the road. So that's another major piece. Beyond that, also it's partnering with Fish and Wildlife. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department is our sister department in the agency, and just has an incredible suite of skills and expertise in thinking about the wildlife habitat and the wildlife populations in the state. And as foresters, we play a major role in managing that, but we aren't the wildlife experts. And so we consistently work with Fish and Wildlife to understand what are the implications of our management actions? How can we better implement management on private lands that supports the wildlife that the state is looking for, and helping to meet the interests of private landowners who just love to see, black-throated blue warblers in mature forest conditions, or want to see common yellowthroats in younger forest conditions. So these are it's kind of all over the place in many respects, but it's a very cool opportunity. I haven't seen, I think that's kind of a general overview. And there are a few other things that I want to make sure I touch on, but I want to make sure that I answer people's questions as they come up. Have any come up yet? Oh, okay.
Yep.
Trevor's asking, can I comment on my opinion of the future of UVA this year and over the next 10 years? So I'm guessing that Trevor's asking this because the use value appraisal program is an incredibly important program for the state. I didn't say the year, but it started in 1980. And it allows landowners to enroll in the program, and if they maintain their forest and manage it for saw timber or other values, they get a significant, they get taxed at a rate that's different than fair market value rate. And so generally on the land enrolled, it's about a 90% savings for land that's enrolled in the program, which is really critical for landowners who are looking to hold on to their land, avoid subdividing it, and contribute to the state economically in other ways. So it's really important. But savings that significant come with a price tag. And the price tag is also really significant. I think it says a lot about how much the state values forest land and private forest land. Basically, the state reimburses towns about $15 million per year for land that's enrolled in use value appraisal. On top of that, there's about $45 million that doesn't come into the education fund because of when land is enrolled in the current use program. And the current use program is really significant. There are, for forest land alone, there are about almost 16,000 parcels enrolled in the program and in the forest land program. And it's about 2 million acres of forest land enrolled in the program. That's where landowners are committing to managing it to certain standards, to keeping it as forest. So in many respects, that confidence that the use value appraisal program provides is really important and something that Vermont needs to maintain. On the other hand, it comes with those significant costs. Those are just the kind of statewide costs. There are significant administrative costs as well. With 13 county foresters every year, our county foresters are reviewing about 15 management plans. Those management plans are in hard copy files back at the offices of each county forester. And so, and every time a plan comes in, there are 3 maps tied to it, and the county forester needs to take 2 and send them to property valuation review, who, with the tax department, they administer another part of the program. And so So I think Trevor's asking that because it's really important, and there are real financial challenges related to both COVID and at the scale that the program has been growing. It's as I mentioned, we've got basically the same number of county foresters delivering the program as we did 60 years ago. So it creates a bunch of challenges. And before COVID was even part of the picture, we were recognizing that from the county forester perspective, and the administrative elements, the best work of county foresters is not doing the administrative documentation that's necessary to maintain the integrity of the program. That work is incredibly critical, particularly given the investment, to make sure that the state is investing and foregoing revenue that is justifiable. On the other hand, it's a lot of work. And when a county forester is sitting in the office 4 days a week instead of out with the landowner, supporting them and guiding them and responding to their questions and interests, there's a missed opportunity. And so we've been working with, when I came on board in this program in 2015, or in this position rather, one of the first things we did was worked with the consulting forester community to basically do a series of listening sessions. And what we heard were a lot of frustrations that I think we could tie back to the administrative role of county foresters in delivering the program. And we continued to work with them throughout the year, and we worked with both a small group at the time, we called it core working group, and more broadly the consulting forester community, to develop a list of 70 recommendations for the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Number one among those was to develop a long-term advisory board or advisory committee, and which we have since put in place. It's the Private Lands Advisory Committee. And we're working on a number of efforts to basically maintain the integrity of the program, but approach the processes of delivering the program differently, and more efficiently and more consistently, so that both landowners and consulting foresters can have more consistent and predictable service and outcomes from their work, and county foresters can more efficiently manage the administrative responsibilities while meeting the same quality standards we have today, but basically reducing the time in the office and getting out in the field, where we can do what we see and what we hear from landowners and consulting foresters as being the most valuable work of the county foresters. So that's a long way of saying the administrative functions of the program, there's nothing shiny, there's nothing really exciting about that work, except for folks like me who see on the other side of all that database management and kind of management plan template design and all that stuff. I see county foresters working with landowners more than they do today, and consulting foresters and loggers, and that's where we have the best and most positive impact. And so what we're trying to address that barrier. I think right now on the administrative side, kind of in the background, that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now. I think everybody appropriately is asking what's the future given the current economic situation and things like that related to COVID. And right now, I think it's too soon to tell. I think people are very clear and very committed to supporting UVA. Given the price tag, there's not a single year that goes by without attention paid to the program and asking the question, what can we do to reduce the cost? Are we doing this right? And given a price tag, question needs to be asked all the time. It makes sense. And over and over, what happens is we reflect on the benefits and the impacts and the need for the program, and it's sustained in the way that it has for those reasons. But I think as we get a better understanding of the circumstances related to the financial situation, the fallout from COVID, that's going to be its own present its own challenges. Related to that, I think it's important to understand that even if the program itself remained the same, there are real significant economic impacts to the forest industry from COVID. The purchasing of timber, there's been a lot of low-grade wood markets that have been lost very recently. Ticonderoga in New York is not purchasing pine pulp for the month of June, as I understand it. And then in Maine, one of the main purchasers of low-grade wood is out of business due to an explosion shortly after COVID. And in addition to that, housing starts and all the other drivers of the forest-based economy are also, just like everything else, aren't in great shape. And so what that means for landowners is that if they're looking to support young forest habitat, or they're looking to do timber stand improvement, or they're looking to really do a good job in managing their forest, which requires growing high quality trees and removing low quality, poorly formed trees, then the margins for them and the loggers are very different than they were just a year ago. And so doing that good work is much more difficult. And so again, we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but there are parts of the country where, whereas I work with my counterparts, where the only way forest management gets done is when Natural Resources Conservation Service pays for it, because there aren't the markets. And when I was hearing that, like in Arizona, it's just, I couldn't fathom not being able to manage for the wildlife species, not being able to invest in invasive species control because of the revenues that come from active forest management, and or making, or the difficulty in doing proper closeout to maintain water quality, because that takes a meaningful investment. And so the choice that landowners could be faced with is to not do those things while harvesting the timber that has the little wood that has some value, which is just a terrible scenario and outcome that is basically we live with for the next 100 years, the outcomes of that kind of management. Or alternatively, we don't manage. And that also allows erosion on unkept roads to continue, invasive species continue to spread, and it creates a pretty nasty cycle for the forest economy if loggers or mills don't have a source for material or products to move to. So it's our ability to support landowners in actively managing their forest depends on those markets. And in our role, or in my role as private lands, we don't have a major function in supporting those. But I think it's important to advocate for them, and let folks know that if we want to manage for wildlife habitat, you need markets. If we wanted to control invasive plants, we need markets. Good management comes from the opportunities to be flexible and do the right thing, and markets help that significantly.
If I can go through those questions. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. I was doing that and I couldn't get off mute quick enough. So here's a question for you. We have 20 acres, about half is successional forest, what used to be pasture. I'd like to reduce invasives like buckthorn and honeysuckle and promote bird habitat. Can EQIP and the community wildlife programs help accomplish that?
So yeah, so EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program through NRCS, depending on the context, depending on the ownership and income situation, so on, can be used to help control invasive plants. And I think that the circumstances related to, if it's successional forest, okay, and the goal is to promote bird habitat. Okay, so EQIP can help to control those invasive plants. The community wildlife programs, I'm not sure specifically what those are referring to. Can anybody else help me out with those? Okay. Jeff, if you want to expand on those, be interested, but certainly young forest is a great opportunity for managing for certain bird species, and controlling invasives and supporting that habitat is an awesome goal for landowners, and ensuring that invasive plants don't thrive in that and spread to the rest of the forest, I think is great. There are NRCS funding opportunities, and I think folks who are interested in that should look into it.
So here's an interesting question. I can't tell who's hosting these, unfortunately, but what interesting advances do you see in technology trends for forestry and land management? I just read something last week that was fascinating. So
share it.
Yeah, well, it was about the drones that they're using, that they've developed up in the Northeast Kingdom for inventory purposes.
Yeah, so I think that there's, in different parts of the country and parts of the world, I think that the ability to remotely evaluate conditions on the ground, whether it be standing timber, species diversity, structural diversity, kind of on the ground topographic features, are amazing. LiDAR is playing a major role in this. One example in Vermont is that there's been some work at UVM to get a statewide layer that basically combines aerial imagery with LiDAR at a very fine resolution. LiDAR is, I think, it's basically gives you a fine resolution topographic map. And you can see very, very small changes in elevation. And so certain applications to this, they're doing a forest cover map where historically, in looking at forest cover, we would be looking at 30 meter by 30 meter pixels of mixed wood, hardwood, or softwood. And now they're 1 meter resolution pixels. So there's more than 1 pixel per tree in this mapping. And when I saw them go from the historic approach to the current approach, I said, well, where did mixed wood go? He said, well, we're not mapping a group of trees, we're mapping individual trees. So it's hardwood or softwood. And that floored me. NRCS funded a project that UVM explored that assessed forest roads. And this ties into the water quality discussion, where we have a great roads are a major contributor to sediment and phosphorus, and we have a great understanding of where town roads and municipal roads are, but we don't have a solid understanding about town roads. So how do you understand where the challenges are? And using some LiDAR stuff, UVM was able to look at some areas in Franklin County and Rutland County and do mapping of forest roads and do an evaluation of where there were some erosion challenges. And though it was imperfect and there were some segments of each road that were missing, where there were major challenges related to erosion, they were able to pick up on some of that. And so from a statewide level, it's easy to pull that in. I think that there's going to take time. It's going to take time to and innovation to recognize how does this get utilized on the landowner scale and the parcel scale. And there are a lot of kind of caution signs that need to be employed whenever we use this kind of technology. And those caution signs are needed because right now the data we collect, we have a professional out on the ground who saw it with their own eyes, who measured the trees, and it is when we see either forest data or acknowledge a need to address an issue, it's based on direct observation. When we utilize this technology to evaluate something remotely, if we jump to conclusions that what the model says it's supposed to be, this is an erosion challenge, that or an erosion issue that needs to be addressed, it may not be. And so we need to be able to understand for ourselves and communicate out with consulting foresters and landowners how to interpret this this new way of presenting information.
Thank you, Keith. So there's another question here from a new landowner who has 90 acres of a wilderness camp that is in the land trust. Who would you talk to about laying out a plan for that land?
So there are about 250 licensed consulting foresters in the state. And so ultimately they could do a great job in preparing a management plan. Before you do that, oftentimes landowners will connect directly with the county forester, and the county forester can help the landowner to ask the right questions to the forester to understand who's going to be a good fit. With 250 consulting foresters, they have a great diversity of skills and focuses and things like that. So a consulting forester who's a great fit with one landowner, a different one might be a great fit with you. And so understanding how consulting foresters will approach the job is important to understand. A county forester can help you evaluate that, and they can point you to the consulting foresters providing services within your county.
Thank you. So we're going to circle back here to current use, Keith.
Yeah.
As the impacts of climate change become increasingly more severe, what changes do you anticipate being made to UVA to adjust to them?
You know, I think that I don't anticipate changes to the program directly, but I do think that forestry and how we approach management can evolve. And some of the ways that we should be adjusting our management is recognizing that when we implement the acceptable management practices to maintain road infrastructure, what worked 25 years ago, we're dealing with different scales of storm events. The culvert sizes that were appropriate then are not the same ones that were appropriate today or will be appropriate 30 years from now. And so while that's not a UVA change, it changes what constitutes appropriate management on the ground. So there are some things that are shifting with that. Like just a couple of years ago, the AMPs, the acceptable management practices for maintaining water quality on logging jobs in Vermont, was revised, and the culvert sizes was increased to accommodate some of those changes. That kind of adaptation will need to continue to follow the science and understanding of what kind of strategies we deal with storm events. Thinking about invasive plants are an increasing threat, and our ability to manage for regeneration in forests it needs to evolve. The degree to which we support structural diversity in our forests is going to continue to benefit, because that's supporting a different suites of species and more resilience. So I think as a forestry community, we think about management differently than we did, well, frankly, even 10 years ago. And projects like Foresters for the Birds and things like that have really helped to, and Woods Wildlife and Warblers have really helped to cement some of those changes and change the conversation in the forestry community about climate change. Recently, Forest Parks and Recreation hired a climate forester, Ali Kosiba, and she's been working across the forestry division to really understand what is the work that we're doing in Vermont, what is the current status of climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation as it relates to forests. So it's important that we get a really strong handle on the baseline of our efforts, and I think that is really going to help us understand what directions we can go. Frankly, there's been a lot of discussions about the need to reduce cutting because one of the greatest strengths of forests in dealing with climate change is carbon storage and sequestration. And so that is true. And so because of that simple fact, a lot of people have advocated for reduction of cutting so that forests can do that to the maximum extent. And I understand the instinct to move in that direction, but it doesn't consider the complexity of how landowners own forests and what forestry does for management and how we adapt to climate change. For instance, the right thing to maximize storage of carbon may be to not cut it, but the right thing to adapt to that forest to climate change so that it can, for the long term, sequester and store carbon may be to support different species in that stand. And in certain places, probably not all, but in certain places, management may be one of the best things that we can do to support climate change adaptation. Another example would be, I've got a major invasives problem in my forest, and without some additional funds, I'm not going to control those. And so using a harvest to help address some of those climate change concerns would be another piece of the puzzle. And so I think that question of how is UVA adapting, there is some advocacy to support, to reduce cutting on both state lands and private lands, or to limit it. And I think the solution is much more complex than that. it is appropriate to identify places where we do less cutting, and it is appropriate to identify places where we harvest and manage forests with a real eye towards climate change resilience and adaptation. Both are true, and I think that is, if we as landowners and a forestry community can allow both to be true and figure out what is the right approach where, as opposed to what is the right approach applicable everywhere, because that won't be the case. What is the right approach and where, and what is the right mix? I think that's going to help us move in the right direction together. And so I feel like that's how we prefer to approach that.
Thank you, Keith. So Lisa mentioned one of the things that she had learned from you, and here's one of the things that I understand came from you as well. Could you talk about that a little?
Sure. When the Foresters for the Birds project started, this was a project that was, it was a landscape scale restoration project that was funded by the U.S. Forest Service, and it was started between Audubon, Vermont, and Forest Parks and Recreation. And the goal was to think about how to refocus what management goals are, and think about management not necessarily through the lens of saw timber and forestry, but instead through the lens of bird habitat, and specifically interior forest bird habitat. And so in the conversation, there was a kind of shift in the paradigm where you need to be considering the structural elements of the forest and the habitat that they provide. And you need to be thinking about what's happening on the forest floor, what's happening in the mid-story, what's happening in the overstory. You also need to be, and so there's a whole bunch of living things. These are the living structures, looking at the understory. And then there's kind of dead stuff that we're thinking about. What is the litter of the forest floor, the leaves and duff? What is the coarse woody material that's sitting on top of that? What is the status of the snags, den trees? And so it's kind of a long list to remember. And so in thinking about it, we were trying to get this book for landowners with Kristen Sharpless, and to just quickly remember and help do, like, what is the quick evaluation? We said, well, birds have 3 toes. Think about the dead stuff, think about the living stuff. And when you point them out, living stuff, just helping you to remember the living stuff. What's happening in the understory? Is it non-existent? Is it dense? Where is it at? Mid-story, overstory, and then same finger or other hand, same fingers looking at the dead stuff. What's the litter material? What's the coarse woody material? What's the status of the snags? Based on that evaluation, if there's something that's deficient in the forest that birds need, you could consider how to approach or shape your management through that. And it's been interesting to see where Foresters for the Birds has gone. And it's interesting to see people in other parts of the country standing in the woods doing this. I mean, I think if I died today, it's a success. No, it's a fun tool, and I still use it to just do a quick evaluation. It's very helpful for me.
And Steve Hagenboot always gives you credit.
Nice. Thank you.
I know where it came from. Okay, so here is another question, and this goes back to carbon, I believe. Are there established strategies for assisting landowners in looking at their forests from a carbon perspective?
Hmm.
What in particular should a landowner look for in understanding the carbon in their wood so it's actually meaningful?
Yeah, you know, there are established strategies. I mean, let me back up. There are some established strategies for looking at it from a carbon accounting standpoint, which can be a very involved process, very costly process, and it's usually an investment that folks make from um, when they're considering marketing their carbon. And there are a lot of hurdles for us to navigate in the forestry community in Vermont related to that. But carbon management is something that has a place in forestry outside of carbon markets. And so I have seen a few management plans that utilize the standard collected data to estimate the carbon storage in a forest. That could be used outside of marketing carbon. But there are general principles to consider in carbon storage, and large trees, mature forests, and down wood, and healthy soil, and interestingly maintaining AMPs, because carbon can be lost through exposure of soil and erosion. Those are kind of the principles for it, but quantifying it or evaluating has not become mainstream among consulting foresters, though I have seen a few folks exploring how to do it. There are some really good resources, and Lisa or Kathleen, the Paul Catanzaro's and Tony D'Amato's explanation of forest carbon and carbon management just came out. I think it was in the fall of 2019. Is just an awesome resource to describe what is the deal with carbon in forests, what's the difference between sequestration and storage, and when is it occurring in a forest, and what are the management strategies to help address this. And it does a good job talking about the mix of thoughtful management coupled with some places that maybe have some reduced management in places.
Looks like Lisa might be looking that up. I'm sure she'll put that in the chat box there. So Keith, one of the questions we've typically asked all the county foresters, what is your favorite tree and why?
Eastern hemlock is my favorite tree.
And why?
When I was studying forestry at UVM, and we got introduced to the Silvics of North America, and we were learning about how dependent trees are on light to grow, and there's a way of go get some water then. Sorry about that. He's like a tree. He needs light and water. So when I'm learning about trees, there are trees that have different tolerance for shade, and there are shade intolerant trees like aspen and paper birch and things like that really need a lot of light. And then there are shade tolerant trees that can deal with a fair bit of shade, like beech and sugar maple. And so I'm looking at this big book, Silvics of North America, and it basically describes every tree and all their kind of natural history, their traits, seed size, how far seeds fly, and things like that. And one of the notes at the very bottom describing Eastern hemlock as one of the most shade-tolerant trees in North America, and anecdotally described a tree that was released at maybe it was 400 years old, and it was a little sapling, and it grew to a full-size tree. And I may be mixing up the specifics of that, but the principle of it, that a tree can sit in the understory and wait and survive, and then be released and exposed to the sun and grow to a full-size tree, to me is, I don't know, I want that for everybody. I mean, the resilience that displays and the endurance it displays to become what it could is, I think I'm probably applying way too many human traits to it than I should as a forester, but it's something that I have a lot of respect for. A lot of respect for.
Can I add something? This is Dave Wilcox. Hemlock is my favorite tree also. I've never met anybody who hemlock is their favorite tree. And I'm not just saying this because Keith is my supervisor. My reason for liking it is a little bit different. I find them easy to limb, and they make big boards. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Dave. So we have another question for you here, Keith.
Okay.
30 acres of forest, 30 acres of abandoned orchard, 30 acres of hayland, and 2,000 feet of frontage on Lake Champlain. Can you recommend an entity to help me identify priorities? Preloaded question.
I'm going to scroll down. This is, it's funny that there are a whole bunch of scenarios in when we're thinking about policies and things like that, that they feel like the word problems in math class from elementary and middle school. Like 2 trains are running down the track at 45 miles an hour. Okay. So 30 acres forest, 30 acres abandoned orchard, 30 acres hayland, frontage on Lake Champlain. When we think about priorities with landowners, I think the question is, there are a couple of places. What are places that are really important to the things that live there? Frontage on Lake Champlain, there are some really important communities, places for rare plants, things that are really, that only grow on the shores of Lake Champlain. And so I hope for any landowner that is in line with what they care about, and I would help them to consider, to learn more, to perhaps discover a love for what's happening on the shores of Lake Champlain. But what's happening, what the priorities are really depend on what you care about as a landowner, and care about the specifics of what's happening in that forest. Not all forest is the same. And so, and what's happening in the orchard and what's happening in the hayland. So I think that as a landowner, reflecting on what you care about and what you want to see from your land is important. I think learning about your land objectively is one of the best ways to kind of let those values emerge. For instance, I've got some land in Underhill, and there are things that I am still learning about it today that I'm discovering as a priority for me. For example, I've been on this property. I hike this land more than every now and then, but I saw a seep, wet area. It's pretty cool, and it's a seep, and it's a place for amphibians and some early season sedges and things like that. But But it's an unmaintained road. I don't really go up in there in the winter. And then one year I get up there and there's like 4 feet of snow everywhere except right on the seep. And it stays exposed all year round up on the side of Mount Mansfield. And it's just amazing to me. And so all of a sudden I understand how this thing functions in a different way. And previously it was an afterthought. Now it's a priority. And so to me, it's just important to learn about your land. And a phrase that I've used since I was consulting was know and love your land. Knowing it and understanding it is the start of understanding how to take care of it. And so I think that before I evaluate my priorities, I want to understand it as much as possible. So that's a long way of saying, a very long way of saying, talk to a bunch of different people. Go to the ANR Resource Atlas, the ANR Atlas, and look at a bunch of different layers or Vermont Biofinder, and you can explore your property and some of the values that other people may have seen on it, but may not have communicated to you. Talk to a consulting forester. They're going to pay attention to certain values as well. Talk to a county forester, and collect as much information about it as you can. And then I think some of those priorities will emerge for you as a landowner.
Thank you, Keith. Oh, and Lisa has put a link to the Biofinder. Thanks, Lisa. It really does come down to what does the landowner want for the land and what's important to you. Even working with a consulting forester, you want to know that first. You know, what really is important to you. So, we are at 9:58. If there are any last minute questions you haven't asked, now would be a good time.
Kathleen, I'm just going to add a little bit. One of the first steps that I advise our landowners to do is talk to one of the people in Keith's program, one of the county foresters. So if you're in Addison County, talk to Chris Olson, invite him out to your property. If you take 3 foresters out onto the land, you might get 4 or 5 opinions, which is why it's really important to talk to different people, as Keith noted, to continue to learn and explore, take that bird's eye view of your property. What do you have on your property that someone might not have next door? Maybe that grassland is really important for grassland birds because you don't mow it every year, and so they get to pull off their broods versus the farmer next door who's haying it every year and does that for their livestock. But you know, you can get those birds off. So it does depend on your goals and your objectives. Start with your county forester. If you're in UVA, you likely had a consulting forester, or there was a consulting forester that prepared that plan. You can talk to them. Come to a coverage training, attend these programs online that are available right now. But when we get to be in person, go in person. These are all opportunities for you to be a good steward of your land on that journey of a landowner.
Great,
Great, thank you so much.
Great wrap up. So we are at 10 o'clock. Time for us to end, but I don't want to cut us off if there are any questions. There are certainly comments. This was excellent, Keith. Many thanks.
A ton of fun. Thank you.
We really do appreciate your time and your expertise. This has been really good for us to spend Friday mornings with some of our forestry experts. And I think next week we're going to hear from Emily Potter, who is the new Memorial County forester. And lots more in store, folks. So please pay attention. Make sure you get the Vermont Coverts or Vermont Woodlands e-news so you know what we have planned. And come and join us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.